He did not marry her out of love. He married her because a ribbon tied around his forearm 3 years earlier had never left his memory, and because the girl standing in front of the firing line, shaking but refusing to run, turned out to be wearing that same ribbon's twin around her wrist. Duke Robert Willis was not a merciful man. Everyone on that field would have said so, and everyone would have been wrong, because mercy was exactly what stopped his hand when his soldiers raised their muskets toward Melissa Barlow. Rain had turned the field outside Ashford Hollow into a shallow lake of mud. Smoke drifted low over broken fences. Men were shouting orders that nobody obeyed anymore, because the battle was already decided, and what remained was only the cruel business of rounding up what was left of Adam Barlow's rebellion. Melissa stood with her hands raised, soaked through, her dark hair plastered to her face, watching 6 rifles point at her chest. She did not close her eyes. She had decided, somewhere in the last mile of running, that if she was going to die for her brother's ambition, she would at least die looking at the men who killed her. Hold your fire. The voice cut through the rain like a blade through wet cloth, and every soldier froze. Robert walked toward her with his coat torn at the shoulder and blood crusted along his jaw from a wound that had reopened during the fighting. He stopped 3 feet away and stared at her wrist, where a strip of pale blue ribbon, frayed and stained, was tied in a small, careful knot. "Where did you get that?" he said. It was not really a question. It was a man confirming something he already knew and did not want to be true. "It was mine before it was anyone else's, Your Grace," Melissa said, and her voice shook only a little. "I tied it there myself. 3 years ago, outside a tavern on the Dunmore Road, on a man I did not know, bleeding from a knife wound he would not have survived until morning." Robert's men exchanged looks. Nobody understood what was happening except the 2 people standing in the mud, and even one of them was only beginning to understand it herself. "You saved my life," Robert said quietly. "I did," Melissa answered, "and I would remind you that saving a man's life does not entitle him to end mine simply because my brother is a fool." A ripple of astonished laughter went through the ranks of soldiers, quickly swallowed by fear of the Duke's temper. But Robert did not look angry. He looked, for the first time since the war between their 2 families had begun, like a man who had just been handed something he could not put down. He turned to his lieutenant. "Take her to the carriage. Unharmed. She rides with me. Your Grace, her brother." "Her brother is not standing here," Robert said. "She is, and I do not execute the woman who kept me alive to hate him." That decision, made in under a minute on a rain-soaked battlefield, would shatter a kingdom's expectations, end a war that had bled 2 great houses dry for a generation, and lead Duke Robert Willis into a marriage that everyone believed was madness. Everyone except the 2 people who would come, slowly and against every instinct they owned, to understand it as the truest thing either of them had ever done. Subscribe to follow how the rest of this world unfolds, and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from tonight. I would genuinely love to say hello and hear how far along in the story you are. 6 weeks before the battle at Ashford Hollow, Melissa Barlow was folding linens in a house that no longer felt like a home. She was 24, unmarried, and quietly considered a disappointment by the only family she had left. Her mother had died when Melissa was 12. Her father had followed 4 years later, leaving the Barlow estate and its considerable debts to his only son, Adam, who was 8 years older than Melissa and convinced, with a self-assurance that had never once wavered, that he alone understood what their family was owed. What the Barlows were owed, according to Adam, was land that had belonged to their grandfather before a Willis ancestor won it in a rigged card game 2 generations back. What the Barlows were owed, he said at every dinner, every gathering, every quiet moment Melissa tried to enjoy her tea in peace, was respect that the Willis name had stolen from them piece by piece for 40 years. Melissa had heard the story so many times she could recite it in her sleep. She had also, quietly, in the privacy of her own mind, stopped believing all of it. Land disputes did not require burning barns. Respect was not restored by ambushing carriages on the Dunmore Road. "You are too soft for this family," Adam told her one evening, watching her stitch a torn coat sleeve that belonged to one of his men. "Father would be ashamed of how easily you forgive. Father would be ashamed of the men you keep in this house," Melissa said without looking up. "I have heard what they say when they think no one is listening." Adam's jaw tightened. You hear what you want to hear. I hear a man named Grigg boasting about a knife wound he gave a stranger on the Dunmore Road last spring, Melissa said. I hear you laughing about it. That stranger was riding with a Willis patrol. That stranger was a person, Adam. Her brother did not answer. He never answered when she was right. Only when he could redirect the conversation toward the grievances that fed him better than any meal. It was that same knife wound, weeks earlier, that had brought Melissa out into the rain on the Dunmore Road in the first place. She had followed Grigg's boasting to its source out of something she could not fully name. Guilt, maybe, or a refusal to let her family's cruelty exist unwitnessed. And found a man collapsed against a tavern wall, bleeding through a coat too fine for the company that had attacked him. She did not know his face. She only knew he was dying, and that nobody else was stopping to help. Melissa tore the ribbon from her own bonnet and tied it hard around the wound, pressing until her hands ached, until a stableman finally came running with a physician close behind. She left before anyone thought to ask her name, walking home through the rain with her brother's cruelty sitting heavier in her chest than it ever had before. 2 days after the tavern, she overheard Adam and Grigg laughing in the study about the man they had left bleeding on the Dunmore Road, wondering aloud whether he had survived, treating the question as though it belonged to a hunting story rather than a human life. He was still breathing when we left him, Grigg said, refilling his glass without a trace of shame. Willis men are stubborn. I would not be surprised if he crawled home. Pity, Adam said, and the casual cruelty in that single word settled into Melissa's chest like a stone she would carry for months. One fewer enemy would have simplified things considerably. She stood outside the study door with her hand pressed flat against the wall, forcing her breathing steady, and understood in that moment something she had suspected for years but never allowed herself to fully accept, that her brother's war was not about land or honor or anything resembling justice. It was about a hunger that no victory would ever satisfy, a hunger that would keep consuming people, one bleeding stranger at a time, until someone finally stopped him. She never told Adam what she had done. She never told anyone. It was the one thing in her life that belonged entirely to her, uncomplicated by the feud, by her family's name, by any debt owed or collected. She did not know, that night, that the ribbon would find her again, tied around the wrist of a duke, on a battlefield, months later, in a moment that would rewrite the rest of her life. The carriage ride back to Willis Manor was silent for the first hour. Melissa sat wrapped in a soldier's cloak, watching the Duke across from her study his own hands as if he had never noticed them before. You could have let them shoot me, she finally said. It would have solved a great many problems for you. It would have created a great many more, Robert answered. I do not build my house on the bones of the woman who kept mine standing. Your Grace, I did not save you out of loyalty to your title. I did not even know your title. I know, Robert said. That is precisely why it matters. He did not explain further, and Melissa did not press him, though the question sat in her chest for the rest of the journey and for every day that followed. By the time they reached the capital, news of Adam Barlow's failed uprising had already spread through every drawing room in the kingdom. Men who had followed him were arrested. Estates were seized. The Barlow name, once merely disliked, became something closer to poison, and Melissa, innocent of every conspiracy her brother had built, found herself standing in the middle of the wreckage with nowhere left to stand. Lady Isabel Willis, Robert's aunt and the sharpest tongue in 3 counties, did not bother softening her opinion when Robert informed the household of his decision. You intend to marry a Barlow, Isabel said, setting down her teacup with enough force to rattle the saucer. The sister of the man who tried to burn half our tenant farms to the ground. Robert, I have watched you make difficult decisions your entire life, but this is not difficult. This is reckless. She saved my life, Aunt. She is also the reason half of society will assume you have lost your mind. Let them assume what they like, Robert said. I did not ask their permission to survive that battlefield, and I will not ask it now. Isabel studied her nephew for a long moment, searching his face for the boy she had raised after his own parents died, and found instead a man who had already decided something and would not be talked out of it by reason, tradition, or fear of scandal. Does she know why you are doing this? Isabel asked. Robert did not answer, and his silence told his aunt everything she needed to know. The wedding announcement, when it came, spread through the newspapers like a struck match dropped in dry grass. The Duke of Willis to Mary's sister of the traitor Barlow. Cartoonists sketched Robert as a fool led by pity. Rival lords whispered that he had gone soft, or worse, that he had been seduced into a trap set by a family desperate to save itself from the gallows. Melissa read every headline in silence, standing at the window of the small guest room she had been given, still uncertain whether she was a bride or a hostage. "You could refuse," Mrs. Todd told her gently, arranging a tray of tea she suspected Melissa would not touch. Mrs. Todd had been the housekeeper at Willis Manor for 11 years, and she had a way of speaking plainly that Melissa found she trusted almost immediately. "His Grace cannot force a woman to the altar, whatever the papers say." "He is not forcing me," Melissa said. "That is what confuses me most. He has offered me a way out of prison, out of shame, out of a future I did not choose for myself, and asked for nothing in return except my presence at his side. I do not know what to make of a husband who gives that much and explains that little." "Perhaps," Mrs. Todd said, "you will simply have to stay long enough to find out." That evening, Robert found Melissa in the Manor's library, curled into a window seat with a newspaper spread across her lap, reading the latest cartoon depiction of their engagement with an expression that hovered somewhere between amusement and exhaustion. "They have drawn you remarkably unflattering," Melissa said, holding up the page so he could see the caricature. An exaggerated Duke on bent knee, a shadowy Barlow figure looming behind a curtain with a dagger. "They have drawn you as a criminal mastermind," Robert observed, leaning over her shoulder. "I confess I find that far more insulting on your behalf than anything they have said about me." "I have decided to take it as flattery," Melissa said. "No one has ever accused me of masterminding anything in my life. My brother rarely allowed me near a decision important enough to mastermind." Robert was quiet for a moment, watching her fold the paper with more care than the thing deserved. "Does it trouble you, the talk?" "It troubles me less than starving in Bath as a companion to a woman who would have forgotten my name within a fortnight," Melissa said. "I have survived worse opinions than a cartoonist's ink, Your Grace. I intend to survive this one as well." "You do not have to call me Your Grace when we are alone," Robert said. "It seems an unnecessary formality for two people about to be legally bound to each other for the remainder of their lives." "What would you prefer?" "Robert will suffice." "Very well, Robert," Melissa said, testing the name carefully, as though weighing whether it fit. "In that case, you should know that your cartoon nose is entirely too large, and I intend to say so publicly if anyone asks my opinion of it." He laughed, startled again by how easily she managed to find humor inside a situation that had cost them both so much, and left the library that night with the beginnings of something he had not expected to feel toward the woman he had married out of guilt, something that felt, cautiously, like anticipation for the years ahead rather than mere obligation toward them. The wedding itself was small, quiet, and entirely without joy on the surface. Melissa wore pale gray instead of white, a quiet rebellion against a marriage the entire kingdom believed was punishment dressed up as generosity. Robert stood beside her at the altar with his jaw set and his eyes fixed straight ahead, and when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, neither of them reached for the other's hand. Willis Manor did not welcome its new duchess. The servants curtsied when they had to and whispered when they thought they could not be heard. Footmen exchanged glances when Melissa passed. A upstairs maid dropped a full tray of china rather than be caught alone in a hallway with her, as though the Barlow name might be catching, like a fever. Only Mrs. Todd treated her as a person rather than a scandal. "Pay them no mind," Mrs. Todd said, guiding Melissa through the Manor's East Wing on her first morning. "Fear makes people foolish, and this house has been afraid of the Barlow name for longer than you have been alive." "I understand their fear," Melissa said. "I have lived with my brother. I know what that name has cost people." "Then you understand something most duchesses never bother to learn," Mrs. Todd said, "which is that respect is not owed to a title. It is earned in 100 small mornings nobody is watching." Melissa held on to those words through dinners that felt more like trials than meals. Lady Isabel rarely missed an opportunity to remind the table, in tones dripping with false sweetness, that the new Duchess had grown up in a household that funded arson. "Tell me, my dear," Isabel said one evening, cutting into her lamb with surgical precision. "Did your brother teach you to set fires as well, or was that a skill reserved for the men?" "My brother taught me a great many things, Lady Isabel," Melissa answered evenly. "Mostly what I did not wish to become." A younger cousin at the far end of the table, Stanley, Isabel's nephew, a slight man with an easy smile that never quite reached his eyes, laughed a beat too loudly at the exchange, then leaned toward the guest seated beside him. "She has spirit," Stanley murmured, just loud enough to be overheard. "One wonders whether it is spirit or simply practice lying to powerful men." Robert's fork went still against his plate. "Stanley, merely an observation, cousin." "Keep your observations to yourself at my table," Robert said, and the warning in his voice ended the conversation, though it did nothing to soften the coldness that followed Melissa up the stairs each night. She did not cry in front of any of them. She saved that for her own room. Late, when the manor had gone quiet and there was no one left to perform strength for. Robert, for his part, remained a mystery she could not solve. He was courteous at dinner and distant everywhere else, disappearing into his study for hours, avoiding her company as though proximity might cost him something he was not prepared to lose. Melissa began to wonder, in her weaker moments, whether Mrs. Todd's kindness was the only genuine welcome she would ever receive in this house, whether she had traded one kind of exile for another, simply better decorated. There were small mercies, even in those early weeks, and most of them arrived through Mrs. Todd's dry sense of humor. When a footman muttered a rumor about Melissa keeping a hidden dagger beneath her pillow, Mrs. Todd loudly announced at breakfast that she had personally searched the Duchess's rooms and found nothing more dangerous than a well-worn book of poetry and a truly alarming number of hairpins. "If her grace is plotting anything, Mrs. Todd said, straight-faced, setting down a plate of eggs in front of a startled footman, "it is plotting to organize this household's linen cupboard, which has needed a firm hand since before you were born, Thompson." Thompson, caught red-handed as the source of the rumor, turned the color of the tomatoes on his plate and said nothing further about daggers. Melissa found herself laughing properly for the first time since her arrival, a real laugh that surprised even her, and Mrs. Todd allowed herself a small, satisfied smile at having earned it. "You see," Mrs. Todd said later, once the kitchen had quieted, "a house does not change its mind through arguments, Your Grace. It changes its mind through mornings like this one, where fear looks foolish next to a plate of overcooked eggs." So she stopped waiting to be welcomed and began, instead, to make herself useful. She walked the tenant cottages with a basket of bread and medicine, learning names the way her brother had never bothered to learn the names of the men who died for him. She sat with sick children. She listened to complaints the manor's stewards had ignored for years. Slowly, without announcing it to anyone, Melissa Barlow began building something that belonged entirely to her. Not a title, not a marriage, but a place in people's trust that no rumor could easily take away. It was Joel, one of the estate's younger stewards, who first brought Melissa the ledgers nobody else wanted to look at too closely. "I do not mean to overstep, Your Grace," Joel said, setting a stack of account books on the small writing desk in her sitting room, glancing over his shoulder as though the walls themselves might report him. "But the numbers have not balanced properly for years, and no one above me seems willing to ask why." Melissa opened the first ledger and began reading by candlelight long after the rest of the house had gone to sleep. What she found, over several nights of careful comparison, was a pattern too consistent to be accidental. Tenant rents recorded as paid in full while cottages sat behind on repairs, harvest profits that shrank on paper every year while the estate's actual yield, according to Harvey the head groundskeeper, had steadily grown. "Someone is skimming from both ends," Harvey confirmed quietly, when Melissa asked him to walk the eastern fields with her under the excuse of inspecting fences. "Has been for longer than I've worked here, and I've worked here 9 years. Do you know who?" Harvey hesitated. "I have suspicions, Your Grace. I would rather you draw your own conclusions than trust in old groundskeeper's grudges." Melissa took the ledgers to Robert 3 days later, laying them across his desk with the confidence of a woman who had already done the difficult work and simply needed him to see it. Your steward's office has been quietly stealing from your own tenants for years, she said. Money marked as spent on repairs that were never made. Rents recorded as collected that were never paid, with the difference pocketed somewhere between your books and your bank. Robert studied the pages in silence for a long moment, and when he looked up, something in his expression had shifted, not suspicion, not the guarded distance he usually wore, but something closer to respect. How long did this take you to find? A week. It would have taken less if anyone had bothered looking sooner. No one has bothered looking sooner because no one in this house has cared enough to look, Robert said. He closed the ledger slowly. I will have this investigated properly. Thank you. It was such a small exchange, and yet it changed something between them. Robert began seeking her opinion at dinner instead of merely enduring her presence. He asked about her visits to the tenant cottages and listened, really listened, when she described the widow whose roof had finally been repaired, the family whose eldest son had been given honest work instead of debt. The villagers had already begun calling her the People's Duchess, a name that reached Robert's ears before it reached hers, carried by Mrs. Todd with poorly hidden pride. They say she treats a farmer's complaint with the same seriousness as a lord's, Mrs. Todd told Robert one evening, refilling his glass. That is not a small thing, Your Grace. Most duchesses never learn it at all. Robert found himself watching Melissa across the dinner table differently after that. Not as an obligation he had taken on out of guilt, but as a woman whose intelligence and quiet stubbornness had begun, without his permission, to unsettle every assumption he had carried about the Barlow name. You surprise me, he told her one evening, the two of them alone on the terrace after the rest of the household had retired. I did not realize I was attempting to. That is precisely why it works, Robert said, and for the first time since the wedding, Melissa heard something warm underneath his careful formality, something that sounded, if she let herself believe it, almost like the beginning of affection. Their evenings on the terrace became a habit neither of them named aloud. Robert began finding excuses to linger after dinner instead of retreating to his study, and Melissa began finding herself watching for the sound of his footsteps before she admitted, even to herself, that she was listening for them at all. You dance poorly, she told him one evening, when he attempted, with visible reluctance, to practice the steps required for the upcoming gala. I do not say that to wound your pride, Your Grace. I say it because someone ought to warn you before Lady Ashworth's entire ballroom witnesses it. I was taught by a tutor who valued precision over enjoyment, Robert said, stepping on her hem for the second time in as many minutes. Forgive me. Warfare, apparently, prepared me poorly for waltzes. Warfare prepared you to stand very still and glare at things, Melissa said, laughing despite herself as she guided his hand back to her waist. Dancing requires you to actually move, Robert. I am moving. You are shifting your weight the way a man shifts cannon fire. Try, perhaps, imagining I am not in enemy formation. He laughed then, properly, a sound she had not yet heard from him in all her months at Willis Manor, low and startled as though it had escaped before he could stop it. That is possibly the least romantic instruction I have ever received. I did not marry you for romance, Your Grace, Melissa said, though the teasing warmth in her voice suggested otherwise. I married you to avoid a firing squad. Romance appears to be an unexpected bonus. An unexpected bonus, Robert repeated softly, looking at her in a way that made the joke feel suddenly fragile, suddenly true in a manner neither of them had intended. He did not step on her hem again for the rest of the evening. The charity gala at Ashworth Hall was meant to be a quiet evening. A public appearance to soften the scandal of Robert's marriage, a chance for society to watch the Duke and his controversial bride share a dance and decide, collectively, whether the marriage could be forgiven. It did not stay quiet for long. Melissa noticed the man near the terrace doors before Robert did, a stranger in ill-fitting formal dress, standing too still among a crowd that moved and laughed and drank without him. She noticed his hand drift toward his coat as Robert crossed the room toward the refreshment table, and she moved before she had fully decided to. Robert. The pistol fired half a second after she shoved him sideways, and the shot that would have found his shoulder instead grazed hers, a burning line of pain that dropped her against a marble pillar as the ballroom exploded into screaming and chaos. Robert's men had the shooter on the ground within seconds. Robert himself was on his knees beside Melissa before the echo of the shot had finished rolling through the hall, his hands pressing against the wound in her shoulder, his voice low and urgent in a way she had never heard from him before. "Stay with me. Melissa, look at me. I am looking at you," she managed, half laughing despite the pain. "You are rather difficult to look away from at the moment." He did not laugh. His hands were shaking as he tore fabric from his own coat to press against the wound, and it was in that moment, with blood on his hands and fear stripped raw across his face, that he saw it. The ribbon, faded nearly to white, still tied carefully around her wrist beneath her glove, exactly as she had worn it since the day he found her on that muddy field. He had known, of course, since Ashford Hollow. But something in seeing it now, soaked at the edge with her blood as she bled to protect him a second time, broke something open in him that guilt alone had never managed to reach. "You saved my life twice," he said quietly, as the physician arrived and began working over her wound. "And I have spent this entire marriage treating you like a debt I was obligated to pay, when you have been protecting me since before I ever knew your name." "You were not obligated to marry me, Robert," Melissa said, wincing as the physician tightened the bandage. "You could have simply thanked me and let me go to Bath, or wherever the world intended to hide a Barlow woman with no fortune and worse prospects." "I could not," Robert said, and for the first time, he did not disguise how much that admission cost him. "I did not want to." Melissa reached up despite the ache in her shoulder and touched his jaw gently, the way she might have soothed a frightened child, though the man in front of her was anything but a child. "I did not want anything from you either, Robert. Not gratitude, not a title, not a manor full of servants who whispered my name like a curse. I only ever wanted to know that the man I helped that night lived long enough to become someone worth the trouble." "He did," Robert said, his voice rough. "He became a man foolish enough to spend 3 years hunting for a stranger he could not find, and lucky enough that she found him again on a battlefield instead. Foolish and lucky in equal measure, apparently," Melissa said, managing a small, pained smile. "It appears to suit you." The physician cleared his throat, gently reminding the Duke that his wife required rest rather than conversation, and Robert reluctantly stepped back to allow her to be moved to a private room, though he did not release her hand until the very last moment, and returned to her side within the hour, still in his blood-marked coat, refusing every suggestion that he change or sleep. Before Melissa could answer, before either of them could follow that admission any further, Isabel arrived at the edge of the small crowd, pale and furious, holding a folded letter that had been discovered, she said, in the confusion following the shooting, a letter allegedly addressed to Melissa, allegedly proving contact with her brother in the weeks before the attack. "Robert," Isabel said, her voice tight, "you need to see this before you decide anything further about your wife's loyalty." The warmth that had just begun to grow between them cooled instantly, replaced by a silence heavier than any of the ballroom's screaming had been. The letter was a fabrication, though no one in the manor knew it yet. It had been written in a hand that closely resembled Melissa's, sealed with wax pressed by a signet ring that closely resembled the Barlow crest, and planted in the confusion of the shooting by a man who understood exactly how much damage a single piece of paper could do to a marriage already balanced on uncertain trust. Stanley had been waiting for an opportunity like this since the wedding announcement first humiliated his family's name by association. He had spent months quietly corresponding with Adam Barlow through intermediaries, offering information about the estate's finances and Robert's movements in exchange for a promise. Once Adam reclaimed what he believed was owed to his family, Stanley would be rewarded with land, influence, and a place in a new order that no longer answered to Robert's authority. Forged documents were easier to produce than either man expected. A few bribed clerks, a convincing hand, and Melissa Barlow could be made to look like exactly what society already assumed she was, a spy planted in the enemy's own house. "I did not write this," Melissa said, staring at the letter Robert held out to her in his study, her voice steady despite the fear tightening beneath it. "I have never corresponded with my brother since the day you brought me here. I would not know how to reach him even if I wished to, which I do not." "The seal is your family's crest," Robert said, though his voice carried none of the certainty his words should have. The hand resembles yours. Then someone has taken great care to make it resemble mine, Melissa said. Robert, I have given you every reason to trust me and no reason at all to doubt me. And yet a single piece of paper appears in the chaos of a shooting meant to kill you. And suddenly, I am guilty again simply for being born a Barlow. Isabel, standing near the fireplace with her arms crossed, was not so easily moved. Forgive me if I find the timing suspicious, Robert. A letter appears the very night her brother's men attempt your life. I did not choose the timing of an assassination attempt, Lady Isabel, Melissa said sharply. And I certainly did not orchestrate one against a man I threw myself in front of a bullet to protect. The room fell silent. Even Isabel, for all her suspicion, could not immediately argue with the plain fact of the wound still bandaged beneath Melissa's sleeve. Robert looked between the two women, torn in a way that felt worse than any battlefield decision he had ever made, because this time the wrong choice would not cost him a war. It would cost him his marriage, and perhaps something he had not yet allowed himself to name. I will not condemn you on the strength of a single letter, he said finally, but I cannot ignore it either. I am ordering a full investigation into the letter, into the shooting, into everything that has happened since that night at the gala. Until it is finished, I ask you to understand that doubt, however unwelcome, is not the same as accusation. It feels remarkably similar from where I am standing, Melissa said quietly, and left the room before he could see how close she was to tears. For the first time since her arrival at Willis Manor, Melissa found herself wondering whether the life she had built there, the tenants who trusted her, the ledgers she had helped correct, the fragile warmth that had begun growing between herself and her husband, could survive a lie clever enough to look exactly like the truth. It was Evie, one of the manor's youngest maids, who found the letters that finally turned the investigation in Melissa's favor. She had been assigned to air out an unused study on the manor's third floor, a room that had belonged to Robert's late father and had gone largely untouched since his death. Behind a loose panel in the desk drawer, Evie discovered a small bundle of correspondence tied with twine. Letters addressed to no one, written by Melissa in the months before her marriage, describing a stranger she had helped on the Dunmore Road, wondering quietly to herself whether he had survived, whether he ever learned who had tied the ribbon around his wound. She had written them for herself. She had never intended anyone to read them. But hidden among her own belongings when she first arrived at Willis Manor, packed hastily during the chaos of her family's collapse, they had somehow been misplaced into her late father-in-law's old study by a maid unpacking her trunks, and had sat there, forgotten, until Evie's careful hands found them and recognized, with growing excitement, exactly what she was holding. "Your Grace, I think you need to see this," Evie said, breathless, presenting the letters to Robert with the same nervous pride Joel had shown months earlier with the ledgers. Robert read them in his study, alone, and understood within the first page that he was holding proof of something far more valuable than an alibi. He was holding proof of a woman who had cared for a stranger's life with no expectation of reward, who had wondered about his fate in private, unwitnessed moments that no forger could have invented. The forged letter unraveled soon after. Joel, cross-referencing the estate's clerks against recent unexplained payments, traced a suspicious transaction to a scribe recently employed by Stanley under a false name. Under careful questioning, the scribe confessed everything. The forged seal, the imitated handwriting, the payment arranged through an intermediary who had, in turn, been corresponding with Adam Barlow for months. Robert confronted Stanley in the manor's great hall, in front of Isabel, in front of the household staff who had gathered at the commotion. "You conspired with the man who tried to have me killed," Robert said, his voice dangerously quiet, "to frame my wife for a crime she never committed, in exchange for land and influence you had no right to promise yourself." Stanley's easy smile finally cracked. "I did what any reasonable man would do when a Barlow was welcomed into this family and treated with more warmth than a blood relation. You did what a coward does when he cannot achieve anything through honest effort," Isabel said, stepping forward, her face pale with a fury Melissa had never seen directed at anyone but herself. "I judged this woman based on nothing but her family's name, and you exploited exactly that prejudice to nearly destroy her. I will not forgive myself for that easily, Stanley, but I promise you I will begin by making certain you answer for it. Robert cleared Melissa's name publicly within the week, standing before the same aristocracy that had mocked his marriage months earlier and declaring, without hesitation, that his wife had been wrongfully accused, that the true conspiracy had been orchestrated by his own cousin working alongside the very man responsible for the attempt on his life. That evening, alone in her sitting room, Robert found Melissa staring out at the darkened gardens, the bundle of her own old letters resting on the table beside her. "You knew," she said quietly, without turning. "About the ribbon. About the man on the Dunmore Road. You knew before the ballroom, didn't you?" "I have known since the battlefield," Robert admitted. "I recognized the ribbon the moment I saw it on your wrist. I did not tell you because I did not know how to explain what it meant to me without admitting how much of my life had been shaped by a woman whose name I never learned. And now I find I am tired of explaining nothing at all," Robert said, crossing the room to stand beside her. "You saved my life on a battlefield I do not fully remember, and you saved it again in a ballroom I will never forget. I have spent this marriage treating gratitude as a burden, when the truth is far simpler than I allowed myself to admit." "What is the truth, Robert?" "That I have come to love you," he said, "not out of debt, and not out of guilt, but because you are the most honest, most stubborn, most quietly courageous woman I have ever known, and I do not wish to spend another day pretending otherwise." Melissa turned to face him fully for the first time since the accusation, her eyes bright with an emotion she had been guarding for months. "I have loved you for longer than I ever intended to, Your Grace. I simply did not believe you would ever say it back." He closed the distance between them slowly, giving her every chance to step away, and when she did not, he kissed her. Carefully at first, and then with the certainty of someone who had finally stopped fighting a feeling he no longer wished to win against. Peace did not last long. Adam Barlow, informed by a fleeing Stanley that his scheme had collapsed, understood immediately that his last remaining leverage over the Willis family was standing in Willis Manor wearing a wedding ring. He struck 3 nights later, while Robert was away inspecting damage from a storm on the estate's northern boundary. 2 of Adam's remaining men slipped past a distracted household guard and took Melissa from the garden path, where she often walked at dusk, leaving behind nothing but a torn shawl and a note demanding the dukedom's northern lands, its mining rights, and a full pardon for Adam's crimes in exchange for her safe return. Robert received the news riding hard through the rain, and something in him that had remained carefully controlled since childhood finally broke loose entirely. "Where?" he said to Harvey, who had found the note, his voice flat and terrifyingly calm. "An old fortress on the Dunmore Road, Your Grace. Abandoned since before the war." Joel recognized the seal on the note. It belonged to Adam's grandfather. "Assemble the men. Quietly. I want no negotiations sent, no ransom discussed. I am not paying a criminal to return what he had no right to take." Isabel, arriving breathless at the stable yard, caught his arm before he mounted. "Robert, you cannot simply ride in alone." "I am not riding in alone," Robert said. "But I am riding in tonight, and I am not waiting for permission from anyone, including you." The fortress was exactly as abandoned as Harvey had described. Crumbling stone walls, a courtyard overtaken by weeds, torches burning in only a handful of windows where Adam's remaining men kept their captive. Melissa had spent the hours since her capture doing what she had always done in the face of her brother's cruelty, refusing to be afraid where anyone could see it. "You look thinner than the last time I saw you," she told Adam, when he finally came to gloat over his captive. "Prison does not agree with your appetite, apparently, though I imagine ambition rarely leaves room for anything else." "You have grown a sharp tongue in that manner," Adam said. "Married comfort has made you bold. Married comfort has made me honest, which you have never been able to tolerate," Melissa said. "You will not win this, Adam. Robert will not surrender a single acre to a man who tried to kill him twice. Then he will watch what happens when he refuses." The night stretched long inside the fortress, and Melissa spent it doing the only thing available to her: watching, counting, remembering. She counted the guards Adam had left behind, 5 in total, none of them particularly disciplined, all of them drinking more than men on watch duty ought to drink. She remembered the layout of old fortresses from stories her father used to tell, narrow servant passages built for staff rather than soldiers, forgotten by men who only ever thought in terms of front gates and battlements. When one of the younger guards brought her a plate of bread, he clearly felt guilty about withholding. She used the opportunity to ask quiet questions, learning without seeming to pry that the western door remained unguarded after midnight, that the men expected no response from Willis Manor until morning at the earliest. She did not attempt to escape. She was not a fool, and 5 armed men against 1 wounded shoulder, still healing from a gala shooting, were not odds worth gambling on alone. But she filed away every detail anyway, the way she had once filed away her brother's cruelties, patient and watchful, waiting for the moment those details might matter. That moment arrived with Robert's silent arrival before dawn, and when the confrontation began, Melissa was not merely a captive waiting to be rescued. She was already moving toward the western door the guard had unknowingly revealed to her, already putting distance between herself and Adam's blade before Robert's men had fully secured the courtyard. A small, private victory that belonged entirely to her own quiet courage, even as her husband's arrival ensured she would not have to win it alone. Robert arrived before dawn, his men surrounding the fortress in complete silence, cutting off every path Adam's small remaining force could use to escape. The confrontation, when it came, was brief and brutal. Adam's men, understanding within minutes that they were outnumbered and unpaid for a fight they no longer believed they could win, surrendered without much resistance. Adam himself made one final, desperate attempt, dragging Melissa toward a side door with a blade against her arm, shouting demands that no one in the courtyard was inclined to meet. "Let her go," Robert said, stepping forward alone, his voice carrying across the courtyard without a single tremor of fear in it. "You have already lost everything you were fighting for, Adam. Do not lose your life as well over pride you cannot afford anymore. You stole my family's name and turned my own sister against me. Your sister was never yours to lose," Melissa said, and in the half-second Adam's attention flicked toward her voice. She drove her elbow hard into his ribs and threw herself free, stumbling toward Robert's outstretched arms as Adam's blade clattered uselessly against the stone. Robert's men had Adam restrained within moments. It was over as quickly as it had begun. No grand duel, no final speech. Only a man whose ambition had finally run out of people willing to bleed for it, kneeling in the dirt of a fortress that had never truly belonged to him. "You are safe," Robert murmured against Melissa's hair, holding her tightly enough that she could feel his heartbeat still racing beneath his coat. "I am not letting anyone take you from me again. I was never planning on being taken anywhere without a fight, Your Grace," Melissa said, laughing shakily against his shoulder, equal parts relief and exhaustion. "You will find I am rather stubborn about that." "I am counting on it," Robert said, and kissed her forehead, right there in the ruined courtyard, in front of soldiers who had stopped pretending not to smile. Adam Barlow stood trial before the Crown's magistrates 6 weeks later, and this time there was no ribbon, no mercy, no forgotten debt to save him. The evidence against him, the ambush attempts, the assassination plot, the kidnapping of a duchess, left no room for leniency, and he was sentenced to transportation for the remainder of his natural life, stripped of what little remained of the Barlow name standing. He did not look at Melissa once during the entire proceeding. She did not need him to. She had spent enough years waiting for her brother's approval and had finally, standing in that courtroom beside a husband who held her hand without shame, stopped needing it. Stanley's punishment was quieter, but no less complete. Isabel, exercising authority within the family that few had ever seen her use, stripped him of his inheritance and his place within the household, informing him plainly that a man who would frame an innocent woman to satisfy his own jealousy did not deserve the comfort of a family name he had never honored. "You will find employment or you will find poverty," Isabel told him, in the last conversation the family ever had with him. "Either way, you will find it far from this house." Isabel's reckoning with herself took longer, and it was gentler, because it was aimed inward instead of outward. "I judged you the moment you arrived in this house, based on nothing but a name you did not choose and crimes you did not commit. I let that judgment nearly cost you everything, and I am ashamed of how easily I allowed it. You were protecting your family, Lady Isabel, Melissa said. I cannot fault you entirely for that, even when it wounded me. I was protecting a name, Isabel said. You have taught this entire household what a family is actually built from, and it is not a name at all. I would be honored, if you would allow it, to start again as your aunt rather than your accuser. Melissa took her hand, and something in the manor's long-guarded formality softened permanently that afternoon. Mrs. Todd, who had believed in Melissa from the very first uncertain morning, took the greatest satisfaction in watching the household transform around her. Footmen who had once whispered now greeted the Duchess by name. Tenant families who had once feared the Barlow connection now brought their troubles directly to her, trusting that she would listen. I have kept house for 3 duchesses in my time here, Mrs. Todd told Joel and Harvey one evening in the servants' hall, raising her cup in a private toast. Not one of them ever earned this household's loyalty the way she has. I dare say she is the finest this family has ever known, and I intend to tell anyone who asks exactly that. Robert, watching his wife move through a household that had finally, fully, embraced her, felt the last remnants of a decades-old feud dissolve into something he had never expected to feel toward the Barlow name. Not hatred, not even indifference, but a quiet gratitude that the war between their families had, against every possible odds, led him here. He found her one evening in the estate office, still surrounded by ledgers out of habit, still checking the figures Joel now managed honestly, and he leaned against the doorway simply to watch her work for a moment before she noticed him. You do not need to check those anymore, he said finally. Joel has proven himself entirely trustworthy. I know, Melissa said, not looking up, though the corner of her mouth curved. Old habits, Your Grace. A woman who spent her whole life watching for the moment something might collapse does not stop watching simply because the danger has passed. Then let me give you something else to watch, Robert said, crossing the room and setting a small wrapped bundle on the desk in front of her. Inside, folded carefully, was a length of new ribbon, pale blue, identical in color to the one still kept, worn and treasured, in the top drawer of her dressing table. I thought, Robert said, suddenly a little uncertain, an expression she rarely saw on him anymore, that the old one has earned its rest. It has done a great deal of work holding us both together. Melissa laughed, soft and full, lifting the new ribbon to examine it. You are a duke who commands armies and dismantles conspiracies, and you spent an afternoon selecting ribbon. I spent considerably longer than an afternoon, Robert admitted. The draper thought I had entirely lost my mind. The draper was not entirely wrong, Melissa said, still laughing, and pulled him down by the collar to kiss him properly, right there among the ledgers, in the quiet office that had once held nothing but evidence of theft and now held nothing but the ordinary, unremarkable happiness of 2 people who had chosen each other twice. Robert arranged the second wedding without telling Melissa what it truly was until the morning of the ceremony, when she found her old gray wedding gown replaced with something entirely new, pale gold silk, simple and unadorned, chosen not for scandal or survival this time, but for joy. You already married me once, Melissa said, laughing as Mrs. Todd fussed over the final pins in her hair. Whatever is this second ceremony meant to accomplish? The first wedding was a duty neither of us fully chose, Robert told her, when she finally found him waiting in the manor's garden, surrounded by tenants, staff, and family who had once doubted her and now would not miss the day for anything. This one is entirely a choice. I wanted you to have a wedding day that was not born from scandal or grief, but only from the fact that I love you, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving it was worth every bit of difficulty it took to arrive here. He took her hands in front of everyone gathered, Isabel standing with tears she made no effort to hide, Mrs. Todd beaming from the front row, Joel, Harvey, and Evie clustered together near the roses, Maisie and Thompson holding the doors open wide so every tenant who wished to watch could see. You have saved my life twice, Robert said, his voice carrying clear and steady across the garden. Once on a battlefield I barely remember, and once in a ballroom I will never forget. But the greatest thing you ever saved was not my life at all. It was whatever was left of my heart after years of believing duty and love could never occupy the same room. You taught me they could. You taught this entire estate that kindness is not weakness, and that the family we choose to become matters far more than the family we were born into. Melissa, her own eyes bright, answered him in front of the household that had once feared her name and now would defend it without hesitation. I did not marry a duke for his title, Robert, and I certainly did not marry him expecting to fall in love along the way. But I have learned something in this house that I intend to carry for the rest of my life. That true strength is not found in revenge, however satisfying it might feel in the moment. It is found in the choice to forgive, to serve rather than rule, and to build something worth protecting instead of something worth fearing. In the months that followed, Melissa used her position not for comfort, but for purpose. She established a school in the village for children who had never had the chance to learn their letters. She funded a small clinic, staffed with a physician paid entirely from her own household allowance, so no tenant family would ever again have to choose between medicine and rent. She created apprenticeship programs that gave young men and women honest work instead of debt, undoing, piece by piece, the very corruption she had first uncovered in a stack of forgotten ledgers. Isabel became, exactly as promised, a true aunt rather than a suspicious gatekeeper, spoiling the first of Robert and Melissa's children with an enthusiasm that startled everyone who remembered how coldly she had once received their mother. Mrs. Todd remained at Willis Manor for many years afterward, telling anyone who would listen that she had watched a house full of enemies become a household built on trust, and that she considered it the finest work of her long service. Joel, Harvey, and Evie each found their loyalty rewarded, promoted, trusted, and treated as the good and honest people they had always been, long before anyone in power had bothered to notice. On a warm afternoon nearly a year after the wedding that began with a ribbon on a rain-soaked battlefield, Robert and Melissa rode together through the estate they had rebuilt, past cottages with mended roofs, past children running from the new schoolhouse, past fields that finally, honestly, belonged to the people who worked them. "Do you ever think of that night on the Dunmore Road?" Robert asked, watching her laugh at something one of the tenant children shouted from the roadside. "Every day," Melissa said. "I think of a frightened girl who tied a ribbon around a stranger's arm and walked home certain she would never learn what became of him. I could not have imagined, not in my wildest hope, that it would lead here." "Neither could I," Robert admitted, reaching for her hand as their horses fell into an easy, unhurried pace. "But I have stopped questioning how we arrived, and started simply being grateful that we did." They rode on together beneath a sky finally clear of the storms that had followed them for so long. Two people who had begun as enemies by name and ended as proof that forgiveness, courage, and quiet compassion could outlast even the deepest hatred a family could carry. If this story reminded you that kindness quietly given can return to save you in ways you never expect, and that the family we build through trust often matters more than the one we are born into, consider staying close for what comes next. Subscribe to follow how the rest of this world unfolds, and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from tonight. I would genuinely love to say hello and hear how far along in the story you are.